Good afternoon and welcome to NTIA's Broadband USA webinar series. Today, March 17th, we're going to be covering NTIA's broadband grant programs that were included in the Consolidated Appropriations Act that Congress passed back in December of 2020. Next slide, please. We're going to start by giving you some logistical information. So as you have questions, feel free to use the question box. There's also a chat box, but if you have questions for us, please put them in the chat box as all attendees are in listen-only mode. And we'll be checking that throughout the webinar, but back at the end of the presentation to answer some of those questions. Please note that this presentation, along with the recording, will be available for your viewing pleasure. It will be available by next Monday, March 22nd. So you can look on our website to find this recording as well as the PowerPoint presentation that we'll be walking you through today. Next slide, please. So I'm Laura Spinning, and I'll be your moderator today. I work with the BroadbandUSA Technical Assistance Program and have been with NTIA for approximately 12 years. Also, we have presenters today, Doug Tinkoff, who is our Associate Administrator for the Office of Telecommunications and Information Applications, also known as the Broadband Division. Jennifer Duane, who is our Director of Grants. Jennifer has lots of experience writing a number of different NOFOs and administering a number of different grant programs, so we're happy to have her with us today. And then Scott Woods, who many of you know as our manager of our Technical Assistance Program and has extensive experience working with communities for improving broadband infrastructure and working on their digital inclusion programs. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Doug Tinkoff. Doug, take it away.
Thank you, Laura. And I appreciate all of you joining us today for this presentation. Next slide, please. For those of you that are not familiar with NTIA, or the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, NTIA is the executive branch agency that is principally responsible for advising the President on telecommunications and information policy issues. NTIA's programs and policy making focus largely on expanding broadband internet access and adoption in America, expanding the use of spectrum by all users, and ensuring that the internet remains an engine for continued innovation and economic growth. Next slide, please. The Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021 included several broadband programs to be implemented by NTIA. It requires NTIA to establish the Office of Internet Connectivity and Growth, which will be tasked with performing certain responsibilities related to broadband access, adoption, deployment, such as performing public outreach to promote access and adoption of high-speed broadband service, and standardizing the process by which applying for federal broadband support. It also requires us to establish coordination requirements among agencies that offer broadband deployment funding programs to ensure federal funds are spent efficiently and effectively. Next slide, please. The Act also requires NTIA to establish the Office of Minority Broadband, which will focus on collaboration for internet access and promotion of digital skills and digital inclusion at historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, and minority serving institutions and their surrounding communities, as well as on investment in infrastructure to expand connectivity and encourage further investment. Next slide, please. The Act also requires NTIA to enter into an interagency agreement with the FCC and the Department of Agriculture to coordinate the distribution of federal funds for broadband programs to prevent duplication of support and ensure stewardship of taxpayer dollars. In addition to the establishment of the 2 new offices and the establishment of the interagency agreement, the Act also establishes 3 new grant programs: the Broadband Infrastructure Program, Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program and the Connecting Minority Communities Pilot Program. I'm going to turn it over now to Jennifer Duane, who will provide a more in-depth overview of the new infrastructure and tribal broadband grant programs. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Doug. Next slide, please. So I'm going to touch on first the Broadband Infrastructure Program. This is a program where we have $300 million available to distribute to eligible entities. These include covered partnerships, which are defined in the Act as a partnership between a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state and a provider of fixed broadband service. And the money is available for them to deploy covered broadband projects, which the Act defines as a competitively and technologically neutral project for the deployment of fixed broadband service that provides qualifying broadband service in an eligible service area. And NTIA is working on a Notice of Funding Opportunity, which is a document we will use to open up the application window. We are targeting publishing that in spring of 2021, and we'll be accepting applications for this program in the summer of 2021. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight here a couple of key definitions in the Act that will guide our determinations of the projects to fund under this program. So covered partnerships and covered broadband projects are to deploy qualifying broadband service. Now, this is a term defined in the Act as broadband service with a download speed of not less than 25 megabits per second, an upload speed of not less than 3 megabits per second, and a latency sufficient to support real-time interactive applications. The other key definition to highlight here is eligible service area. So when a covered partnership comes in with a covered broadband project, they will be designating an eligible service area in which to deploy the project. Now, this is defined in the Act as a census block in which broadband service is not available at one or more households or businesses in the census block. And in order to verify that the eligible service area qualifies under this definition, NTIA will be looking at information and maps provided by the Federal Communications Commission through its Form 477 data and other information that's available. NTIA will also leverage its National Broadband Availability Map in determining what qualifies as an eligible service area. And the other key definition that I want to highlight is unserved. And that means a household lacks access to qualifying broadband service and no broadband provider has been selected to receive federal or state funding to deploy qualifying broadband service in that area. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch on a couple of the funding priorities that the Act identifies. It does list very specific priorities that NTIA will take into account as it evaluates applications, and in decreasing order, the priorities are to provide broadband service to the greatest number of households in an eligible service area. The project also should provide broadband service in an eligible service area that is outside an urban area. So the focus will be on rural areas. We're also looking at projects that are the most cost effective and prioritizing such projects in areas that are the most rural. And then we'll look at projects that are designed to provide broadband service with a download speed of not less than 100 megabits per second and an upload speed of not less than 20 megabits per second. Next slide, please. Now, I want to touch on a couple of the funding uses for this program. The Act doesn't specifically mention eligible uses for the funding for the covered partnership, but we know that the funds will be used for broadband infrastructure deployment, and we really want to make them broad in terms of what applicants can use the funding for. So they can fund costs of construction, improvement, acquisition of facilities and equipment that's required to provide qualifying broadband service. Long-term leases will also be eligible costs, and the Act also allows the covered partnership to fund a portion of its pre-application expenses or grant preparation costs in an amount that's not to exceed $50,000. The Act also specifically lists some restrictions on the funding, so the broadband provider may not use any of the grant funds to repay a loan that it's received from a public or private lender, and it also may not use the funds as collateral for a loan by a public or private lender. And then I just wanted to touch on some of the deadlines associated with this grant program. So it is a very aggressive timeline for the covered partnership to implement the project. They must expend the grant funds within 1 year after receiving funds from Ntia under this program. Although the Assistant Secretary may grant an extension for broadband construction projects, which will be what most of the activities under this program will entail. And to qualify for an extension, the covered partnership must certify that it has a plan for the use of the funds, the construction project is underway, or extenuating circumstances require an extension to ensure project completion. So I expect that Ntia will be very freely granting these extensions for, because we understand how difficult it is to complete any type of construction project within 1 year. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move over to cover the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Grant Program. There is $1 billion available for funding under this program. The entities that are eligible are tribal entities, and they may use the funds to expand broadband adoption and deployment on tribal lands, as well as to support distance learning, remote work, and telehealth during the COVID-19 pandemic. And like the other program, we anticipate, well, we will be opening the this program through a notice of funding opportunity, and we're targeting that for release in late spring, early summer of 2021. Hopefully no later than summer 2021. Next slide, please. So the Act defines the entities that are eligible to apply for a grant under the tribal program. The eligible entities are tribal governments, tribal colleges and universities, the Department of Hawaiian Homelands on behalf of the Native Hawaiian community, tribal organizations, and Native corporations as defined under the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this tribal grant program is to expand broadband adoption and access on tribal lands. The Act defines tribal lands with 5 components of the definition. So tribal land includes any land located within the boundaries of an Indian reservation, pueblo, or rancheria. It also includes land that's not located within the boundaries of an Indian reservation, but that is held in, but title to the land is held in trust by the United States or for the benefit of an Indian tribe or individual Indian. Also land that is within a region established pursuant to the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. The Hawaiian homelands also qualify as eligible tribal lands. And then the last component is land, is areas or communities designated by the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs of the Department of the Interior that are near, adjacent, or contiguous to reservations where financial assistance and social service programs are provided to Indians because of their status as Indians. So those are the 5 components that we'll be looking at when an applicant submits an application. We'll be looking to see that the tribal lands it submits an application for fall within this definition. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to highlight a couple of funding uses under the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program. So the eligible uses are specifically defined in the Act, and they're written fairly broadly. So broadband infrastructure deployment is an allowable use, and that also includes support for the establishment of carrier-neutral submarine landing stations, cable landing stations. And then there's also some digital inclusion programs, broadband adoption activities that are allowable, telehealth, distance learning, and then affordable broadband programs. Funds may be used to provide free or reduced cost for broadband service, or to prevent disconnection of existing broadband service. The Act also imposes a limit on the amount of the grant funds that may be used for administrative expenses. So an eligible entity that receives funds may not use more than 2% of those funds for administrating the grant. And then just wanted to call attention to the priority for unserved households. So for any new broadband construction that an eligible entity undertakes, they must prioritize projects that deploy that infrastructure to unserved households. And so the definition that I referenced earlier about unserved will come into play as we look at this prioritization of the funding under this program. Next slide, please. So just wanted to highlight a couple of other considerations for this tribal broadband connectivity program. Probably the most important one that NTIA is looking at is this notion of equitable distribution. So the Act mandates that grant funds are awarded on an equitable basis. So they are to be made available to eligible entities on an equitable basis, and then not less than 3% of those amounts shall be made available for the benefit of Native Hawaiians. NTIA held tribal consultations, and there was we received a lot of good input from the tribes as to what constitutes equitable distribution, and whether that involves a formula or awarding through a needs-based evaluation criteria. We're looking at those elements, but that is one of the big decisions that NTIA is making to determine how we can distribute the funding to tribes that benefits them and has an impact, but also meets this mandate of equitably distributing the funds. The other consideration I wanted to call attention to is this commitment and expenditure deadline. So like the other broadband infrastructure program, there are a lot of aggressive deadlines associated with it. So an eligible entity must commit the grant funds to an eligible use no later than 6 months after receiving those funds. And also it must expend the grant funds within 1 year of receiving the funds. So, but again, like the other program for construction projects, the Assistant Secretary does have the ability to extend that 1 year award period for a construction project. The eligible entity just needs to certify that it has a plan for the use of the grant funds, the construction project is underway, or extenuating circumstances require an extension of time to allow the project to be completed. And then there's also an aggressive proposal deadline. So when NTIA does announce the program through the issuance of the Notice of Funding Opportunity, applicants will have, or eligible entities will have 90 days from that date to submit its application for a grant. And that also applies to the covered partnership, which is the eligible applicant under the Broadband Infrastructure Program. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to Scott Woods, who's our Manager of Technical Assistance, and he is going to cover the Connecting Minority Communities pilot program. Scott, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer, for that introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. This is Scott Woods, and I'm here to give you a brief overview of the Connecting Minority Communities pilot program. Next slide, please. So this slide is just a short overview of the CMC pilot program. I want to note it is a pilot program. $285 million that we have to establish the CMC program. And with 3 boxes here just targets who can apply, right? Historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, minority serving institutions, and consortiums that are led by HBCUs, TCUs, or MSIs that specifically include either a minority business enterprise or a not-for-profit organization. The next box talks to us about or tells us what the purpose of the CMC pilot program is for, right? The purchase of broadband internet service or any eligible equipment, or to hire and train information technology personnel for 3 specific but very broad purposes, right? Number 1, to facilitate educational instruction and learning, including through remote instruction, or 2, to operate the minority business enterprise, or 3, to operate the not-for-profit organization. NTIA, we anticipate accepting applications and launch of the CMC pilot program this summer in 2021. Next slide, please. And so this slide, I want to highlight on a few things. Again, these are the eligible institutions as prescribed by the statute, but at least there are a couple of things that I want to highlight. Number 1, the statute says that at least 40% of the CMC funds shall be provided to historically Black colleges and universities. So we have to develop our programmatic rules and criteria around that. Number 2, at least 20% of the grant funds must go to all eligible HBCUs, TCUs, and MSIs to specifically provide broadband internet access service or eligible equipment directly to students. And again, we are working on a final rule. The statute provided that we have to go straight to final rule. Unfortunately, going to final rule, there's no opportunity for the public to provide direct comment. However, we have been providing and conducting our outreach sessions with interested stakeholders, with targeted stakeholders to get your feedback and your input. And we will continue to do so at least for the next several weeks, if not months, prior to finalization of the rule, release of the NOFO, and the launch of the program. In addition, Congress directed NTIA to establish several new methods to administer and verify applicant eligibility under this program. Number 1, we've been charged to identify, determine, and verify CMC applicant eligibility, and we've been working on methods for that. Number 2, also we've been charged with how to identify which eligible recipients in anchor communities have the greatest unmet financial needs. Number 3, we have to ensure that grants under the CMC pilot program are made to eligible recipients in a manner that best achieves the purposes of the pilot program. And number 4, we have to identify those anchor communities that are within a 15-mile radius of each eligible HBCU, TCU, or MSI, and that meets an estimated median annual household income of not more than 250% of the poverty line. We will address these methodologies and rationale for each of these requirements in the final rule, and then obviously in the notice of funding opportunity that will follow. And like I said before, we have continued to conduct targeted outreach, listening sessions to receive input from the MSI community, HBC community, tribal college and university community, and we'll continue to do so in the next several weeks and upcoming months prior to launch of the program. Next slide, please. So just to highlight again, the eligible uses, right? Section 902C really stipulates, it's really specific about the eligible uses of the grant funding. Again, to purchase, broadband internet access service, to purchase eligible equipment, and to hire and train information technology personnel, right? And so the final rule and the NOFO, again, will have all of those requirements so that applicants can get that information and adjust accordingly. There's also Section 902C3 requires interagency coordination with other federal agencies. And so while making our CMC grants, we have to coordinate with other entities like the FCC, the National Science Foundation, and the Department of Education to ensure the efficient expenditure of these federal funds including the prevention of multiple expenditures of funds for the same purposes. So we'll be working in coordination with our other federal agency partners to ensure that behind the scenes. Next slide, please. So Congress also established several priorities, again, that I talked about before. We have to establish several methods to identify applicant eligibility. Again, we have to ensure that the grants under this program are made to eligible recipients, identified in certain manners and criteria, but again, that best achieves the purpose of the program. So, we've got to figure that out. Evaluation is going to be a key component of that. How do we ensure success of the program and for the applicants will also be a key requirement. There's also a couple of prohibitions in the rules. You'll see this also in the final rule in the NOFO. Again, there's standard rules like the applicants can't sell any of the equipment. And if they provide those to students, they have to again lend those or provide those and prioritize students who are at need. And students who are in need are framed by the following criteria. One, are they eligible to receive a federal Pell Grant as defined by Section 401 of the Higher Education Act? Are they recipients of any other need-based financial aid, either from the federal government, either from the state, or that eligible institution recipient? Number three, are there otherwise qualifying low-income consumers for the purposes of the program, which are carried out under federal law? The citation to that is provided there. Number four, are there low-income individuals, as that term or phrase is defined in Section 312G of the Higher Education Act? And then finally, have they been approved to receive some unemployment insurance benefits under any federal or state law since March 1st of 2020? Next slide, please. And so again, I will kick it back to Doug Kinkoff, who will provide a recap. Doug, back to you.
Thank you, Scott. I'll provide a quick high-level recap of the three programs that you just heard about from Jennifer and Scott. The Tribal Grants Program are focused on expanding access and adoption on tribal lands. Eligible entities for the program are tribal governments, tribal organizations, tribal colleges and universities, the Department of Hawaiian Homelands on behalf of Native American, Native Hawaiian community, and Native corporations. Grant funding can be used for infrastructure, including submarine cable landing stations, affordability programs, telehealth, distance learning, digital inclusion efforts, and broadband adoption activities. The Broadband Infrastructure Grant Program is a competitive grant program focused on fixed infrastructure deployment that is technology neutral and can be deployed in a census block with at least one household or business that does not have access to 25.3 megabits per second upload and download service. A covered partnership for this program is between a state or one or more political subdivisions of a state and providers of fixed broadband service. And finally, the Connecting Minority Communities pilot program is focused on providing grants to HBCUs, TCUs, minority serving institutions, and consortiums led by HBCUs, TCUs, or MSIs that include a minority business enterprise or not-for-profit organization for the purchase of broadband internet access or any eligible equipment, or to hire and train information technology personnel. Again, I would like to thank all of you for joining us today. And now I'll turn the back over to Laura Spinning. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and thanks again to everybody for joining today. We appreciate your participation. As I mentioned on the front end, we will be working to make the slides and the recording from today's webinar available on the BroadbandUSA website. You may see some inconsistency in the date. We always commit to getting the material up within the week, and so it says here March 24th, but we are making every effort to get that done on a faster track this time because of the interest in this material, and do commit to having it up this month by Monday, March 22nd. Just be sure to check back on our website if you'd like to review, or if you'd like to share it with somebody who was not able to attend today. And I think we have time for a couple of questions before we wrap today's webinar. All right. One minute. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
You can hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right. I think going on and off mute may have caused some concerns. I've got more questions that I'm certain that we could answer today, but I did want to try to pose a couple of them that came in. So starting with the infrastructure program. So Jennifer, for you, can a covered partnership consist of more than one provider of broadband service?
Thanks, Laura. So the statute does define a covered partnership as between a state, one or more political subdivisions of a state, and a provider of fixed broadband service. So it's in the singular in the statute, but we're viewing that as that more than one fixed broadband service provider could form part of a covered partnership under the Act.
Very good, thank you. All right, I tried to write some of them down because there are so many in the question box. All right, on the tribal program, will NTIA require tribal applicants to provide a cost match to receive a grant under the Tribal Broadband Connectivity Program? Jennifer?
Yeah, thanks, Laura. I'll take that question. So the Act does not specify a maximum level of federal funding, as often is the case in federal grant programs. So NTIA will not impose a cost match on tribal applicants. We realize that a match in the past has often served as a barrier for tribes to participate in federal financial assistance programs, and we want to structure the program in a way that will maximize participation by federal tribes. So even though we have some discretion as to whether to impose a match, we are going to choose not to provide a match requirement or have tribal recipients provide a non-federal share contribution to funding the broadband projects that they propose under this program.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. All right, Scott, you mentioned that under the CMC program, how will you make an equitable distribution of those funds, given the requirement that 40% of the grant funds go to HBCUs? Scott?
Thank you, Laura, and thank you for that question from the participants. Yes, we are actively working with stakeholders from the MSI community, and again, we will address that both in the final rule and then the notice of funding opportunity. But we're going to ensure, obviously, the effective use of those funds, including equitable distributions to all of the eligible entities. And so under the methodology that is required to establish applicant eligibility, we'll be working on that, and again, to ensure the efficient, effective, and equitable distribution of all grant funds, giving those requirements. Thank you.
Scott, are you ready for another one?
I am.
Okay. How will NTIA establish eligibility based on the 15-mile anchor community radius and not more than 250% above the poverty line requirement for the anchor community?
Okay, thank you. And again, thank you for that question. We're actually utilizing our national broadband and availability map. The information that we have there, one of the data layers is from the Census Bureau latest information that they've collected. And so we'll establish that 15-mile zone around the eligible institutions. And again, we'll do some qualitative analyses of the median household income to establish that requirement. And so that process, that methodology and the rationale will be both contained in the final rule as well as the notice of funding opportunity. And we're interested in feedback and any input from the stakeholders that we can get as well. So thank you again for that question.
Very good. All right, Jennifer, back to you. Can a service provider participate in more than one covered partnership?
That's a great question, Laura. Thanks. So I think that question might have come up because one of the requirements in the Act is that a covered partnership may only submit a single application for this program. So I think there might be some question as to whether a service provider that is part of a covered partnership is limited to participating in one covered partnership per state. And NTIA is interpreting that provision as not limiting a fixed provider of broadband service to limit itself to just participating in one covered partnership if it's working with multiple states to provide broadband service under this program, or if it has multi-state operations. We're not saying that it has to choose one state in which to work with. So at least as far as the fixed broadband service provider component of the covered partnership definition, we're interpreting that to allow fixed providers of broadband service to participate in more than one covered partnership.
Very good. Thank you, Jennifer. I think this is related to tribal. It's kind of a two-part question. Will the tribal funds be formula, competitive, or a combination? And can you address the definition of unserved again? Sorry, that's three questions. So Jennifer or Doug, I'm not sure which one of you want to answer this, but you want to start with the part that is about, will it be a formula, competitive, or a combination? Or I'm not sure if we
can I take that, Doug, or do you want me to? Do you want to take that? Or you
can. Thanks, Laura. I think we've received a lot of input through the tribal consults and the outreach we've done, and there's been a vast array of opinions on this piece, and so we are still working through the best mix of that. We haven't ruled out any of the options at this point as we're drafting the NOFA, which Jennifer is doing. So at this point, I think it's still to be determined what will be, how we will actually define that in the final NOFA.
Yeah, and just to add on that, Doug, I mean, we're considering, various approaches and looking at all of those allocation methods that you mentioned, Laura, in that question. So whether it's formula, whether it's some other method of allocation, where kind of all things are under consideration, but our overriding goal is to make sure that the funds are distributed in an equitable manner and in a way that maximizes the benefit for the tribes in deploying broadband infrastructure on their tribal lands or in doing digital inclusion or adoption activities as is allowed under the program.
Very good. Thank you, Jennifer. And then I think the second part of that was if you could touch on the definition of unserved again for tribal, if that's something you can answer today.
Sure. So, I mean, there's in the statute it takes a look at unserved with respect to households, and there is a provision in the Act that when there is new broadband infrastructure deployment, that the tribe prioritizes unserved households. So we'll be looking at that definition when it comes to proposals to deploy new broadband infrastructure on tribal lands, and also take into account other factors that go into that. So we're not really necessarily requiring it, but it is going to be a factor in how we evaluate the proposal.
Thank you, Jennifer. All right. So one other tribal question here. There seems to be lots of tribal questions. For the tribal entities, can they partner with a non-tribal entity to apply for the tribal program?
So the Act defines, eligible entities as the tribal government, the tribal college and university, and or the Native Hawaiian homelands, the Alaska Native settlement, and tribal organizations. And so we see them coming in as as the applicant, but they are allowed to. There is a provision in the statute for sub-grantees, so for them to, which don't have to be tribal entities. So we see that there is flexibility for the tribal entities to partner with non-tribal entities to make sure that they, in their deployment of their project.
Very good, thank you. Scott, back to the CMC program. How will you address the greatest unmet financial need requirement?
Thank you for that question. We're working on that right now. We're looking at a number of different criterias and factors. The Act states that student need is one of the elements of greatest financial need, and so we're working on that. Again, that'll be in the final rule as well as in the notice of funding opportunity. But again, we're anticipating basing that in part on the student need, the financial need of the students of the eligible institutions.
So thank you, Scott. I see we've got some questions here. I'll ask the rest of the panel. I don't think we can answer this question today, but there is a question about, do 5G solutions meet the requirements? And I think this is probably for I'm not sure which program, if it's for the tribal program or the infrastructure program, but do 5G solutions meet the requirement for the broadband definition? I'm not sure
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
No, it's a little unclear from the question, right? We are a technology neutral on those programs. So 5G is a potential solution for the services. So I'm not quite sure how else to address that, given the question.
Yeah, and I think qualifying broadband service is the definition that's in the statute for what, at a minimum, the project should deploy. And we do have a prioritization list within the statute, at least for the broadband infrastructure program, that is also factoring in proposals that will deploy broadband service at higher speeds, such as 100 megabits per second download and 20 megabits per second upload. So, I mean, there definitely is, I think, a prioritization factors that will come into play for faster broadband service. But I think we're open to whatever proposals that applicants want to come in with. Our overriding concern for the broadband infrastructure program is to deploy infrastructure. We're looking at unserved areas, and so we have different factors that we'll look at, and we're open to any type of proposal and any technological solution that an applicant proposes. We'll evaluate those under our criteria, but we don't want to limit any solutions. We want to keep everything pretty open.
Thank you, Jennifer. So, Doug, I'm going to tee this question up for you because it's in here quite a bit in different forms, and that is, there's a lot of questions about the timing and the application, and I believe that what's in the presentation talks about we'll be accepting applications in the summer. Can you say a little bit more about timing for the NOFO on each of the programs and the applications? I think there's some confusion about whether the NOFO and the application will go out at the same time.
So let me just set the table on that. So first, the rule for the Connecting Minority Programs will be drafted, and that will simply be setting forth the rule. And as Scott had mentioned, then we need to publish a notice of funding opportunity. So that one's in a little bit different track. On the tribal and the infrastructure, those both go right to a notice of funding opportunity. They are all currently being drafted. They will then have to go through
they're drafted. They're not, you know, I mean, go ahead.
Well,
I mean, sorry.
Jennifer?
I was going to say, we have drafted the NOFOs. They're just in various stages of, you know, approval. So.
Right, exactly. So once they are drafted, the process, I'm just laying out the process, then they go into the review. Some of them are in review. Once they are cleared through NTIA, Commerce, and the White House, then they will be posted publicly. So it's very difficult to say. That's why we're using broad dates, because we do not control all of those review timeframes.
Okay. So hopefully that clears up that we're working on the timing issue, and it's a matter of getting it through all of the appropriate processes. But for the infrastructure program and the tribal program specifically, those applications will open along with the NOFO being released. Is that correct?
Right, Laura. So when we receive clearance to release the NOFO, it'll be published on our website and on grants.gov, and that will also open up the application window. And all the instructions about how to apply, where to submit applications, that will all be contained in the Notice of Funding Opportunity in the NOFO.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. Sorry, there are so many. I'm trying to find those that are kind of consistent themes. And I will just say that there are really a whole lot of questions about, well, in fairness, there are lots of questions about timing. And I'm seeing that my dogs obviously made a very nice appearance on the webinar today too. Scott, do you want to speak any more specifically to the CMC timing? Again, that seems to be the most consistent question that's being asked. So I feel like just
to address that, yes.
Is the process the same for that?
It's a similar, like Doug mentioned, it's a little different process in that Congress directed us to promulgate rules first. So we have to release a final rule. Once that's published in the Federal Register, we will then release the Notice of Funding Opportunity. That is the official programmatic, that has the official programmatic details, the applications, when it's due, the criteria, everything that a prospective applicant or eligible recipient would need to participate in the program. Because it is a pilot program though, we do have some leeway. Again, there are a number of new requirements that we have to develop in the program. And again, we want to build in, evaluation criteria and all those measures that will ensure, success. So again, that summer time frame is what we're targeting right now. And so again, once we release the Notice of Final Rule, once we release the NOFO, we will have much more precise details and guidelines in those documents once they are published in the Federal Register and released to the public.
Okay, thank you, Scott. There's also a number of questions in about timing related to completion of the project. So I think these are mostly comments, so I'm just going to share them because they are in here so often, and that is that people do expect that because of environmental considerations and other issues, that certainly, construction projects for infrastructure, broadband infrastructure will likely require some kind of extension. I think we're aware of that, but we haven't done it. We can't answer any specific questions about what conditions for those waivers would look like, unless Jennifer or Doug, there's anything more you want to add on that.
I mean, I think the process is well outlined within the statute. It says, that it gives the assistant secretary the discretion to extend basically what is a 1-year period of performance for this grant, because the Act establishes that the grant funds must be expended within 1 year. But it does give the Assistant Secretary discretion to extend that period of performance. And the showing that is said in the statute is the applicant just needs to come in and say they have a plan for construction, or the construction project's underway, or there's extenuating circumstances that require it to have additional time to complete the project. And certainly the environmental requirements that an applicant must, the approvals that it must receive for the environmental and historic preservation components, and what NTIA needs to exercise as its responsibilities to make sure that those statutory requirements are met, would certainly seem to meet that criteria for receiving an extension. So I think, and that process will all be outlined in the NOFO when it's released. We'll provide a mechanism for submitting petitions for extension in that document.
Very good. So, and just because timing has been a pretty consistent question theme, I'm also going to add this one in, which I can't remember if we covered or not, but for each of the programs, and I'll start, Jennifer, with you on the infrastructure program, how long will applicants have to complete an application?
So to complete an application, so the statute indicates that once NTIA issues its notice of funding opportunity, which is the document that will start the program, applicants will have 90 days to submit an application. So, so the date on which we release the notice will also open up the application window for applicants to apply, and they'll have 90 days for that.
Very good. And so that's the same 90 days for both the tribal program
for
and
both
the
tribal and the broadband infrastructure program. So it's both a 90-day application window.
Thank you, Jennifer. Scott, on the CMC program, is there a similar requirement?
No, a little different track with CMC. Again, in part because it's a pilot program. And so, we'll prioritize in the NOFO, what we want applicants to focus on. And so our criteria will be a little different time frame. The statute did not prescribe those direct time frames as it did with the tribal and the infrastructure program. So we have a little bit more leeway. And again, working with our stakeholder outreach, we'll come up with an applicable time frame that we'll address in the NOFO. But again, we want to ensure that all of the recipients can submit, proposals that would, be successful. So I don't anticipate something as broad as, 6 months or on a rolling basis, but it won't be the 90 days. It'll probably be a little bit more broad than that. And again, we will address that in the notice of funding opportunity.
Thank you, Scott. One other thing, I don't think I'm going to pose a question here, but I feel like it's important to share because I know it's come up in some of the submissions that we've received and been talked about quite a bit, but that's the issue of the duplication. So there are a lot of comments, some questions. I've let people know that we will be setting up an FAQ section on our website to address questions that we're not able to get to today, but there are quite a few in there about, our RDOF awarded areas excluded from our programs, some of the other FCC programs, as well as the USDA Reconnect program. And I don't think we're prepared to answer those questions today. We do appreciate people who provided those comments and questions, and would encourage you to check back on our website as we start to make frequently asked questions available for you to review those, and we'll try to answer some of those in a little bit more detail. Another topic that seems like a hot topic in the question box today is around the mapping and data that will be used to evaluate unserved areas. I don't think that's a question that we can answer today, but I guess I would open it up. Doug, do you have any comments about the data or mapping criteria that we'll use, or anything you could share with the group about that topic that seems to be?
Not specifics, excuse me, not specifics, but as Scott mentioned, I think earlier, we are using the National Broadband Availability Map, which incorporates commercial data layers. It includes all the FCC data layers that we have, census, federal government, states, and we'll be utilizing that in these programs, but I'm not ready to go into specifics on how that'll be used in the areas of overlap or those questions regarding RDOF at this point.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be sure, because it has shown up quite a bit, that we acknowledge that that is an issue of great interest and importance, and questions just continue to roll in. Let's see. And I think we covered the question of, for the tribal program, can those funds be used for deploying wireless systems? And actually, the question here is specifically about using the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum that's recently been made available through the FCC's program. So is that something, Doug, you want to address, or Jennifer?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the eligible funding uses under the Act it's pretty broad. It's for broadband infrastructure deployment. So we're going to, continue to view that as pretty broad, and, looking at proposals, and that will, certainly the 2.5 gigahertz would be a proposal that we would look at for deployment. We're not wireless. That the tribal program doesn't specify that it has to be wired broadband infrastructure, so wireless is an option as well. So we'll just be looking for proposals that, that deploy broadband infrastructure, and not, pick any particular technological solution. So we'll be open to various proposals on that. Doug, do you want to add anything?
No, I think well said. Nothing to add to that.
All right. I think we're getting close to the top of the hour, and I'm going to try to reshare my screen so that folks can see. We are doing another webinar next month, April 21st, on some of the grant programs. And spoiler alert, we are working, although it's not been approved yet, to push out a public notice that will allow us to do some more webinars on these programs, so that we can keep you updated as we make progress on getting information out. But do plan to tune in next month, April 21st at 2 p.m. And most importantly, please check our website regularly. I think some of, well, if you're on, you probably weren't aware of this. We are also working to address our platform issues. Both, we heard some of the audio issues that came up today, and we do currently have a 1,000-person limit, which I know we hit today. So I really appreciate everybody joining today. I think this was our most attended webinar of record. So I appreciate all of the interest, and we will try to get back to you on the large number of questions that were in the question box that we weren't able to get today. So please do check back on our website and tune in next month, so that we can keep you updated on these on the progress of these programs. So thanks so much, and have a great day.